Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar where we will discuss everything you need to know about the EU's new General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, as it relates to the disposition of your IT assets specifically. If you have any questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to reach out to us by sending us an email at srs.media@simsmm.com. I would now like to introduce our speaker today, Sean Magann, Global Vice President of Sales and Marketing for SRS. Sean has more than 15 years of experience related to the downstream processing and recovery or reuse of IT and electronic waste. He's an essential part of the executive team here at SRS, and his experience in managing operations across Asia has been conducive in the development of SRS's strategic and comprehensive service portfolio. Without further ado, please enjoy the next 40 minutes learning all about how this new regulation will affect your IT asset disposition program.
The unfortunate news is that it's very complicated, and the rollout seemed like there was plenty of time when it was initially introduced, but May 25th, 2018 will be here very, very soon. But the good news on that is not all the pieces need to firmly be in place, but a firm structure or a framework simply need to be in place. So not all the questions, not all the holes have to necessarily be fixed by May 25th. Just a more general framework on how to deal with the issues need to be put in place. So the goal of GDPR is to strengthen and unify data protection for all individuals within the European Union. It's a pretty simple overview, but it makes sense. As data changes, as data becomes more ubiquitous in all the different devices we have, the laws certainly need to be updated to reflect some of these changes. And again, GDPR is designed to unify the various data privacy laws across the European Union. If you market to or process information on EU data subjects, which could be your end users, your customers, or your employees, you will be affected. And we'll talk more about that. But again, it's something that really needs to be understood, is that it certainly goes out of the scope for companies just operating in Europe. And generally speaking, if any of these 4 bullet points apply, then you could certainly be affected by GDPR. Number 1, you have a business presence in an EU country. So you're physically have a presence somewhere in the EU. Number 2, you have a business presence outside an EU country, but you collect and process the personal data of EU citizens. And we'll come back to that because that's a key point. It doesn't just affect companies physically located in Europe. It could be any company that physically processes data for someone in the EU, an EU citizen. Your company consists of more than 250 employees, and your company has fewer if your company has fewer than 250 employees, but you process sensitive personal data, you can be affected. So again, we can chat more about that, but those are the general criteria on who might be affected by the law. And finally, just to make it clear, is the aim of GDPR is harmonizing the regulations to make it easier but also more comprehensive. And so there was a European Data Protection Directive, 95/46/EC, that was adopted and established in 1998. And as you can imagine, most of us smartphones didn't exist back then. The internet was still relatively new. The data center business has certainly exploded since 1998. So a lot has changed since then. And so GDPR is an attempt to update and harmonize the regulations to take into consideration the state of technology as it is today. So this may be pretty basic for our friends in Europe, but for our folks outside of Europe, the difference between a directive and a regulation, because the previous legislation was a directive, and what a directive seeks to do is to have goals to be achieved by the member states. So the goal would be data privacy, and that's a general goal that would be given to the different member states, and the member states would have their own way, their own process for implementing the change. So again, the goal would be protecting data, but each individual member nation would have their own flexibility on how that was implemented in each member state. And again, as the bullet point says here, the states are free to decide how to implement, right? So Greece could have one method of implementing it, France could have another, right? So it was a bit more of a confederacy than a strict regulation. So that's what a directive is. On the other hand, a regulation is immediately applicable and enforceable by law in all member states. So as soon as this regulation goes into effect, all member states of the EU, it applies to and it is enforceable. So there's less discretion given to the different member states, and it's more prescriptive on how it's done. So that's kind of the difference between a directive and a regulation. And again, GDPR is certainly a regulation. I like this quote. This is from Steve Wood, the Deputy Commissioner for Policy. And he says, what must be recognized is that GDPR is an evolution in data protection, not a total revolution. GDPR is building on foundations already in place for the last 20 years. And again, it's an interesting point to make in that a lot of the individual pieces of GDPR in terms of data protection aren't necessarily new. As I said before, and I don't mean to keep saying the same thing, but what I said before is what's new is a harmonized way in which it's approached. So it's taking all these different a la carte items and building it into a more unified, comprehensive enforcement. So, there's a couple entities involved in GDPR, and again, there's a lot of time spent on trying to define these different entities, but there's personal data, and I'll explain later exactly what personal data can consist of. There's a data processor, and there's a data controller. And one of the questions we get often is what is the difference between a data processor and a data controller? And simply put, a controller is the entity that determines the purpose, conditions, and means of processing of personal data, while the processor is an entity which processes personal data on behalf of the controller. So both are involved, but they have different levels of involvement in processing and moving the data back and forth. Again, as the folks in the EU are aware, these are the countries involved from an EU perspective. Just to go through the list briefly: Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Republic of Cyprus, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, and of course the UK. And so that's one of the most frequent questions we're hearing is about the UK, especially in light of Brexit. So does GDPR apply to the UK? First of all, it's fully expected that the UK will move forward with a framework out of the EU despite the Brexit. The EU, if something does change, it's fully expected that the UK will continue participating in, again, the general framework of GDPR. But again, as I mentioned, GDPR, it doesn't necessarily matter where the data is physically located. It's all about who the data belongs to. So as you would imagine, in the UK, many of the customers of UK entities are EU citizens. And in that case, it will certainly apply. So the Brexit should not affect dramatically the UK's participation and enforcement of GDPR. Again, a lot of it will be determined in the future, but in general, the Brexit should have little if no impact specifically on the protections afforded by GDPR and also the obligations of businesses. Again, we talked a little bit about this, but it is still one of the most frequent questions I get from our customer is, hey, I'm in Singapore, I'm in the United States, I'm in China, do I even need to care about GDPR? And I think the short answer is yes, right? I think if you are unclear, and if you can say with certainty that none of your customers, none of the data inside your databases are from EU citizens, then I guess GDPR is something you wouldn't have to pay attention to. But I don't know with globalization, with folks moving around the globe as they do, I don't know how any business could say, I clearly don't have any EU citizens in my database. I'm not processing any data from EU citizens. I find that difficult to say. So I think every country, now the level of scrutiny, the level of resources putting to GDPR compliance would certainly change depending on where you are. But in general, I think even a rudimentary knowledge and understanding of GDPR is important just because of the fact that in a database anywhere in the world, there could be the data of EU citizens and individuals. So that leads to the next question about is the U.S. affected? And again, not to be redundant, but obviously many multinational companies, even local companies here in the United States will have and will process data from EU citizens. So the short answer is absolutely. American companies need to be aware and have reasonable safeguards in place for GDPR. Now, what's interesting is that there is something called Privacy Shield, which is an EU and U.S. framework to provide companies on both sides of the Atlantic with a mechanism to comply with data requirements when transferring personal data to support transatlantic commerce. So there's a framework set up, the transmission of data back and forth, that is certainly compliant with GDPR. So this is a recognition that both the EU and the U.S. as two huge markets with an enormous amount of commerce and going back and forth in terms of transactions. So there has been a framework set up called Privacy Shield to allow for that transmission of data back and forth. So that's kind of what GDPR sort of is on a high level. This is where the rubber hits the road, I think. You know, why is there so much attention paid to GDPR, and why is there so many concerns about fines and infractions? Because the numbers are big. A lower level infraction or lower level breach could result in up to 10 million euros or 2% of the worldwide annual turnover of the entity, whichever is higher, for a lower level fine. So 10 million being the potential minimum, with 2% being as high. And for many multinational companies, including my company Sims Metals, that's a huge number. So for a low level fine, there's quite a bit of liability. And it gets even more serious when you look at the upper level fines. Upper level fines could be 20 million euros or 4% of the worldwide annual revenue for the entity. So again, 20 million euros or 4% of the annual revenue. Huge numbers, huge amounts of liability. And this is why companies are spending, and we'll show that on a slide moving forward here. This is why companies are spending the amount of money they own on resources to become GDPR compliant, because the fines can be huge. And again, this doesn't even consider the reputational risks that we've seen with other entities that have had data breaches. Those are items that are really hard to calculate. You know, if folks don't trust your brand, if there's brand erosion because of careless handling of data, those are a whole separate bucket of potential liability. But the fines are really big. And what defines a lower level or upper level fine? I'm not going to go into the detail. We can certainly send something out after the webinar. But a lot of it has to do with due diligence. A lot of it has to do with not having a framework in place. So depending on the perception of how proactive a company was in terms of being ready for GDPR can very much affect whether or not it's a lower or upper level fine. And as I mentioned, this is a slide from PwC, just talking about the amount of time, money, and energy companies are spending to become compliant. So again, not to spend too much time on this. Everyone can sort of read this on their own. But it shows that the amount of time and efforts are not small. It is a very, very serious endeavor by major companies to try to become compliant. And again, the money spent here seem insignificant when you look at the fines that I mentioned on the previous slide. I think it's interesting to note that 60% of U.S.-based companies expect to spend at least $1 million to $10 million to meet GDPR requirements. Looking at this slide, another 9% expect to spend more than $10 million. So again, big money, but small compared to the potential fines and reputational erosion of a breach. So we talked about data privacy types. Generally speaking, the basic types of data that are protected by GDPR is, number one, basic identity information, such as name, address, and various ID numbers. Web data, such as location, IP address, cookie data, and RFID tags. Health and genetic data. Biometric data. Racial or ethnic data. Political opinions, and sexual orientation. This is a handful of categories of data that are protected, explicitly protected by GDPR, and it covers just about everything about a person. I also run our marketing department at SIMS, and one of the from a marketing standpoint that have been interesting is the idea of explicit versus implicit implied consent, right? So we've all signed end-user license agreements to where there's 50 different lines, and we agree to things maybe without understanding specifically what we're agreeing to. And we've all done that. We've signed up for something, and we start to get emails because we wanted a contest or we wanted information about a certain event, and all of a sudden we're starting to receive emails from a ticketing agency or whomever it might be. And what's new about GDPR is GDPR is very, very specific that when someone gives permission to use their data, to use their information, it has to be specific to that event. So let me just read a few legal things to you, and we'll chat more about it here in a second. So implied consent, where your consent is given along with a few other details, is no longer sufficient. You cannot say, thank you for visiting my company's website, and the box is pre-checked. It has to be explicit. So the default cannot be yes. The default has to be no. And if someone does want to receive the additional information, is allowing you to use their data, it has to be checked. So the consent has to be specific. Also, you cannot assume that prospects want to be contacted and that the GDPR requires express consent, as I said, but more specifically, consent which is freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous, which is reinforced by a clear affirmative action. So again, the consent has to be, hey, our company will contact you based upon you checking this box. This is maybe the frequency we will contact you. It has to be very, very specific on what will happen once that person checks the box. Very, very, very specific. And again, as I mentioned, companies will no longer be able to utilize long, illegible terms and conditions full of legalese, as a request for consent must be given in an intelligible and easily accessible form with the purpose for data processing attached to that consent, again, meaning it must be unambiguous. So again, it can't be listed and buried within a bunch of other different parts of legalese. And finally, it must be easy to withdraw consent as it is to give. So if someone does give that consent, which again is a bit more complicated now, to rescind that consent has to be just as easy. And this brings us to the next topic, which is the right to be forgotten. and this is something that I particularly find very, very interesting. So the right to be forgotten made headlines in the U.S. in 2014 when a citizen of Spain won a judgment against Google, telling Google that they had to take down some personal information. And so what GDPR does, it extends this right much further, and it requires companies to delete even non-publicly shared data under a variety of circumstances. And one of the circumstances is if the user asks to be forgotten. So you're an individual, you give consent to use your data, and for whatever reason you don't want to receive the emails anymore, you just don't even want to be part of the database, companies now under GDPR have to honor your right of saying, hey, listen, take me out of your database. Don't just stop sending me emails. I want to be forgotten by you. I want my email, my personal information to be deleted from your database. So GDPR is not necessarily just keeping the data safe, which it certainly is a big part of it. It's also a function, it's also an exercise in managing the data to make sure that that same person a year later doesn't get an email from your company, because that clearly is a breach. If Tom Smith here on this slide asks for his information to be deleted from whatever database, ticketing service or whatever it may be, and a year later, 6 months later, he inadvertently receives an email as part of a larger list, there are huge penalties because it's clearly an infraction of GDPR. So again, the management of data, not just the keeping data safe, it's the management of data is a big, big part of GDPR. And so, what we've seen, talking with other big enterprises, is that every company needs a plan that maps its data processes and data handling procedures. And those procedures have to identify any gaps in actions needed to close these gaps and prioritize those actions based on risk. It is really, really important to have clear procedures in place so that when there is a vulnerability, the company is prepared to communicate effectively to all parties to make sure that they can come back into compliance as soon as possible. So this is really, really a complicating factor. I think it's a great protection for consumers, but again, it makes the protection and managing of data a lot more complicated. This is a slide from Google, and this just talks about some of the people who so far have asked to be forgotten. And it just breaks down the type of entities, the type of individual who've gone to Google and say, listen, I want you to take my information off Google. I don't want it to appear in a database. I don't want the bankruptcy I had 10 years ago to be public. There's lots of different reasons people want to be forgotten. And now, as part of GDPR, it's their right. All right, so GDPR, we've talked a little bit about it. I'm sure it's clear as mud with all the different permeations of it. You've got your data protection officer, someone who has to be on board to work with the company to be the go-to person for any data breaches or to have a data policy in place. You've got compliance. You've got the date coming up of May 25th. We've talked about data breaches. We've talked about personal data. Sounds simple, right? With all these different options and variables. Sounds simple, right? Well, it's not. And one of the things we think we can help with, since we're not necessarily strictly in the data business, we and other ITAD recycling companies are involved in data in the sense that companies come to us and ask us to eradicate data. We're not in the warehousing or transmission of data business, but we're certainly the last link in the chain to make sure that data is destroyed. And we do help customers manage their data by having schedules where we come out and can wipe data, destroy data, et cetera. So we see ourselves as a part of the process to make sure that companies have good data protection hygiene, and we think we're one piece of that giant puzzle. And so one of the things we start, and it's been really interesting for our business that more and more companies are coming to us and saying, hey, we see the disposition of assets, data-bearing assets, as kind of the last box we haven't checked yet to make sure we're compliant with GDPR. How can you help us? And so one of the first questions we and our sales team asks is, what did you do before? Right? Before we move forward on improving your ITAD process make sure it's GDPR compliant, is let's form a baseline of your standard practices right now. And so when we ask what do you do before, we get a lot of questions that make me very, very nervous. Companies that are very forthright, and we tell them, hey, listen, we're here to help, so there's no reason to sugarcoat. Let's just talk about your current process, and these are some of the answers we get. It's fine. I'm sure it's being handled properly. They won't tell me. It's complicated. Obviously, there's a need if they're coming to us, and we're here to help. And so regardless of the baseline program, we can certainly help. But as you know, there is data everywhere. Even if you're a local company here in the Bay Area where I live, with globalization, you've got data, you've got customers all over the world. So managing this data, especially within the framework of GDPR, is not easy. So the first realization that we think companies have to do is realize where their data physically is located, right? So we go through and help customers do an inventory of the different locations of the data and the vulnerabilities of those locations. Now remember, as I mentioned earlier, and one of the things GDPR addresses, that IT is everywhere, not just in servers, not just in the desktop environment, it's everywhere. It's in phones, it's in memory sticks, it's in printers, it's in everything. So the first realization is realizing that there's data in everything throughout the enterprise. And older IT equipment, anything that's not on the network or items that are not on a certain inventory system may not be discoverable. So in many cases, there's software out there that will help customers do this inventory, but in many cases it may not be discoverable, again, if it's not on the network or if it's using a different asset management system. So a physical inventory we think is critical to making sure a company knows where all their data is and where all the assets are. As most folks know, to get rid of data and part of your digital hygiene, part of managing the data within an enterprise, you have three distinct choices on how to get rid of data. There's clearing, where data is overwritten. This is often known as wiping. The advantage of clearing data is that the asset could be resold. The disadvantage of clearing, it can be a bit more expensive because it takes a bit more time than the other data destruction methods. So you've got clearing. You've also got purging. Purging is where a magnet is used to destroy the data. Purging is great because it's quick. It's very, very thorough if done correctly. And it's cheap because it's fast. It's relatively cheap to do and can be done on site. Companies like Sims or our competitors can certainly bring out a degausser, quite mobile, and destroy the data on site. The disadvantage of purging is that the asset is essentially destroyed, right? The firmware is removed along with all the data. So the asset that you have, the hard drive, will not be able to be used in the future, number one. And number two, it only works with magnetic media. So SSD drives that are becoming quite ubiquitous, purging is not a reliable, or it's not a method to kill that data. And finally, physical destruction, shredding, is what we still see that's quite popular in data centers. Why? Number one, it's thorough if done correctly. If the piece size is correct for the asset, a mechanical drive has a different piece size than an SSD drive. So if done correctly, physical shredding is very thorough. Seeing is believing. You can actually see the drive in pieces. So one of the, with purging and clearing, some companies just don't like the fact that the asset looks the same, even though the data is destroyed. It could somehow, inventories could be mixed up. Where with physical destruction, there's no way the shredded drive is going to be confused with a whole drive. Obviously, the disadvantage with destruction is that the asset cannot be reused, and the only value left in the asset is commodity value. One of the trends we see with GDPR, and it seems like there's certainly a trend outside of GDPR, is to have fewer vendors involved. And it's because as regulations become more and more harmonized, I think it's incumbent upon companies to find fewer vendors to make sure that they can trust these vendors and that these vendors are in complete compliance with GDPR. So these are what I consider the 4 advantages to single sourcing. And those include single point of contact, consistent processes across all regions. Again, GDPR is certainly applicable outside of Europe, as we've discussed. There's systematic approaches with all data and reporting, and it's reduced workload for clients. And I think number 4 is a point that I think more and more clients are coming around to, and I see it. And we realize that our customers are quite busy in their business that they happen to be in, and that managing assets all over the world isn't something that their time is necessarily super well spent on. And rather than rely on many different vendors to manage that, fewer vendors can help manage it for it and provide reports to clients. So it just makes it easier for clients to manage their assets all around the world. Reporting is key to GDPR. It's important to have backup to show that data has been destroyed. This is an example of a Blanco data report. So if a company ever is audited, it goes down to the device, a specific serial number for that device to show that the data has been eradicated. So reporting is key, we feel, to GDPR compliance. Here's a certificate of destruction from SIMS to show that the actual device itself was physically destroyed. So again, it's great to have this backup in the case of an audit. We find that a lot of successful companies in our space have web-based portals where they can track their assets all around the world from their desktop. So again, if there's a small sales office in Singapore and someone from the U.S. or from Europe wants to make sure that the assets are being handled properly, rather than having to go through reams of reports and Excel spreadsheets, a great online portal. A good online portal is a great tool to have to see the disposition of those assets, to close them out, to say, hey, we had these 4 assets in Singapore. We've got the portal saying they've been destroyed, so it certainly helps manage those assets. Another example of the type of reporting you can get from a portal. Again, another screenshot here. It's important, this is a commercial part of the presentation, it's important to realize that not all ITAD providers are the same. You have to make sure that the company you use to disposition your IT assets are vetted, are insured, and are compliant, because some of the barriers to entry in the ITAD business aren't huge. So there's a lot of companies in the space that are have very ad hoc approaches to ITAD, and again, we feel that is 100% not in tune with GDPR. So you have to have a company with established and vetted processes to make sure that they're compliant with GDPR. Because at the end of the day, it's a client's responsibility, and if the extra $100 you spend with a bigger company like a SIMS or some of our bigger competitors seems small compared to the liabilities if something does go wrong. It's important to know about the various certifications and standards. I'd be curious to see if something comes out specifically to address GDPR, but having the right recipe of the different compliance standards around the world will help create a program, an ITAD program, that's conducive to GDPR. And one of the last questions we get quite a bit, it still comes up, is when companies will ask us, speaking of certifications, the difference between the R2 certification and the eSteward certification. And again, I've said it many times, they're both fine. I think that both of their intents are in the right place. Basically, and this may not be as familiar to Europeans because European laws, specifically on the environmental side, tend to be a bit more robust than the U.S. And so both the R2 standard and the eSteward standard were developed to try to address what could be perceived as looser federal regulations in the disposition of assets in the U.S. So both standards generally try to address that by having controls and conditions in place to limit and regulate where materials can be sent once they're finally processed. That's a general overview. They both migrated to do more, but that's the general remit of both organizations. I think, again, they're both fine. I think neither company will cover the fines of GDPR if there is a breach. So I think, I think it's a great start. We had both certifications. We at SIMS, we've chosen to just go with the R2 standard. It's no disrespect to the eStewards folks. It's just for our business and for our customers, R2 seemed to be appropriate. But again, it matters. It's a good starting point, either one of these certifications, but you really, really need to know the company you're working with. You need to do the vetting, and you need to make sure that the processes are relevant and will protect your company in light of GDPR. And so, for a true global company, you need to have a seamless end-to-end solution to take advantage of data, the value of your assets, the local regulations, and now regulations that have been harmonized in terms of GDPR. So it's complicated, but companies like SIMS and other large ITAD companies can certainly help walk you through the journey. That ends the presentation part of the presentation, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. So Stephanie, I'll turn that over to you. So we're just compiling the questions, so give us 30 seconds to pick out a few of the questions. Unfortunately, we can't get to them all, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. So one of the first questions, and I think it's a really, really good one, is the question says, are there other related regulations I should be aware of when managing ITAD? And the answer is 100% yes. Every country, in terms of data, GDPR was an effort, and a really, really good effort, to harmonize the different regulations. But that's just in regards of data. There's a whole myriad of local environmental regulations, country to country, and in some places within states and provinces within a country. So there's a lot of different regulations related to disposing of assets. So again, there's not enough time to go through each and every one of them, but it's something that as you handle a new location, handle a new project, you need to certainly understand the local regulations, again, not just in terms of data privacy, but certainly in terms of environmental regulations. So yes, so the answer is yes. There's a lot of regulations, and working with a company like SIMS or one of our competitors, I think we can help. Here's another good question. My business is not located in Europe, but we do offer some services in this region. Does GDPR still apply to me? And again, the answer is it could. I would say yes, but I will prevaricate and say it could. And what I mean by that is if the customers, if EU citizens have data that your company is handling, managing, or processing, GDPR will apply to you, assuming all the caveats that I mentioned earlier, the 4 different conditions apply. So the answer is yes. Another company says, another question is, how can I get started with an ITAD company like SRS? We try to make it easy. We realize that ITAD programs have evolved over the years. Most companies, their focus is offering their new product and service somewhere else in the world, and that's where the attention is. And so the ITAD management of the asset sometimes is an afterthought and can have evolved over the few years. And so it seems like changing that can be a big process. It isn't. You reach out to a salesperson at SIMS, one of my business development folks, and we treat it like a project where we can go through and start one at a time, identify locations, identify vulnerabilities, and put a program together. So it just starts with a phone call. A few other questions. Is hole punching a hard drive acceptable under GDPR? There's a document that we often use, the NIST document, and I can certainly send it out, and if anyone has questions, that talks about specifically what is appropriate for the different types of media. So hole punching can be, but it really depends. I mean, there's so many different permeations on, is it a mechanical hard drive? Is it an SSD hard drive? Is it a tape? Is it a thumb drive, right? So hole punching can be, but there's a lot of other different permeations. So I would definitely refer you to the NIST document on specifically what's considered acceptable for data eradication. Another question, good one. We sanitize all of our media devices prior to disposition. Does that regulation require that we document each item that is being disposed of? Really, really good question. I don't know specifically if that will be required, right? I think there's still some uncertainty about that. But I think as a good practice, it should, right? So meaning if you go through it and you do disposition of these assets, I think it's very, very good digital hygiene to track and document the eradication of that device. Because if there is an audit, if there is an issue down the road, it shows that your company's doing the due diligence. So as I understand it, it's not required, but it's certainly recommended to show a process that's in control. And we'll grab one additional question here. Would you suggest that more services be done on site to reduce risks? And it's a really good question. So a lot of our data center customers, because they're not just warehousing individuals' data, they're warehousing their customers' data, which consists of individuals' data, right? Because they're selling their web hosting and their data services to other enterprises. They will have everything destroyed on site. So a lot of our big data center customers will spend quite a bit of time and money having us come in and to physically destroy the devices before they leave. Do I recommend it? It depends. It depends on what your risk appetite is. It depends on, the cost involved. It depends on the local regulations. Sometimes, depending on some countries, on-site data shredding can be problematic. So I think it's a good idea, but I think I would need to know more to really recommend it. But it certainly is a tool, on-site data destruction, that a lot of our customers currently utilize to make sure that once the item leaves, it's just shredded aluminum and steel and copper, et cetera. So I think it's a good idea. And then yes, the document I was talking about is the NIST 800-88 document. And again, if you Google search that, it'll come up, and it's sort of the document most people refer to when talking about data sanitization, not just specifically with hard drives, but all different types of media. So it's the NIST 800-88. So thank you for that clarification. Okay, well, we will go ahead and, Stephanie, we will be posting this, as I understand. And Stephanie will give you all the follow-up details on how you can access this information.
Yes. So we'll be following up with an email. So we'll go ahead and wrap up here. Thank you, Sean, and thank you, everyone, for attending. If anyone does have any other questions in addition, please feel free to either reply to our follow-up email or send us an email at that email address. That's srs.media@simsmm.com. And following today's webinar, you will receive a short survey to the presentation or on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you complete that and provide us with your feedback on today's webinar. And then within about 24 to 48 hours, we'll be sending a link to view a recording of this webinar today. So on behalf of SIMS Recycling Solutions and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of the day.